They say the desert keeps what it wants. Out in Joshua Tree, where the silence can swallow your thoughts and the sun bleaches time itself, people disappear. Some are found. Some are not. And every so often, the desert waits, months, sometimes years, before giving anything back. When a hiker stumbled across a half-buried bone near a creosote bush in the unforgiving backcountry, 13 miles from the nearest road, it cracked open one of the most unsettling missing person cases Southern California had seen in a decade. The remains belonged to Owen Marshall, a man who had vanished more than a year earlier without a sound, without a trace, without a single witness. But it wasn't just the location that raised questions. It was the strange condition of his gear, the eerie details found in his journal, and the lingering fact that Owen was experienced, careful, and well-prepared. People don't just walk into the Mojave Desert and evaporate. Yet that's exactly what seemed to happen. Owen wasn't a thrill-seeker or some overconfident tourist. He wasn't chasing legends, and he didn't go off-grid to prove a point. He was simply tired of the noise, of the screen glare, of a life that felt like it was passing without meaning. In the months leading up to his disappearance, his sister Leah said he had grown quiet in a way that wasn't like him. He started talking about nature more, about how the city drained him, about needing to be somewhere where his thoughts could breathe. When he mentioned Joshua Tree, she encouraged it. "It'll be good for you," she remembered telling him. "Take some time. Be alone. Reset." But hindsight is a cruel mirror. Because when Owen stepped out of cell service and into the sun-scorched openness of Joshua Tree National Park on April 15, 2021, he walked into a place that doesn't always let people come back. That day, he left behind more than an apartment and a job. He left behind a digital footprint that abruptly ended at the trailhead near Black Eagle Mine Road. His phone went silent. His email autoresponder activated. And just like that, a man who'd lived most of his life online disappeared without posting so much as a selfie. At first, nobody panicked. He said he'd be off the grid. It wasn't until he missed his Sunday check-in, and Leah's calls went unanswered, that the concern turned into alarm. The search began. First by rangers, then by helicopters, drones, scent dogs, volunteers. They found nothing. Not a sock. Not a snapped branch. Not a piece of trash. For 13 months, Owen Marshall existed only in a missing persons file and the fading memories of the people who loved him. And then, just as suddenly as he'd vanished, the desert spoke. Owen Marshall wasn't the type to vanish. That's what made it so unsettling. At 39, he was the embodiment of structure. Early riser, black coffee, unread notifications always cleared. He lived alone in a modest second-floor apartment in North Park, San Diego, kept a clean desk, and paid rent a week early out of habit. He worked remotely as a systems analyst, coding software for small logistics companies and cybersecurity startups. People who knew him described him as polite but hard to read, introspective, and predictably responsible. He wasn't the type to ghost people. He wasn't the type to ignore his sister's calls. And he definitely wasn't the type to throw caution to the wind in one of America's most dangerous national parks. Leah Marshall, his younger sister by 4 years, had been his closest companion since their mother died when they were teenagers. She called him 3 to 4 times a week. They shared Spotify playlists, texted book recommendations. She knew when something was off, like the way his voice had sounded distant in early March. Like he was present, but emotionally out of range, she recalled. Owen had told her he was taking some time off work. Not because of burnout exactly, but because he needed quiet. Real quiet. "The world's too loud," he said. "I think I just want to go somewhere I can hear myself think again." He mentioned maybe heading to Big Sur. Maybe Sequoia. Then, he landed on Joshua Tree, its wide silence and alien rock formations appealing in a way he couldn't quite explain. He described it as otherworldly. Leah wasn't worried. Owen wasn't impulsive. If anything, he overprepared for things. He booked an Airbnb just outside 29 Palms for 3 nights, April 15th to 18th. It was a small, off-grid cabin with no Wi-Fi, powered by solar. He drove out from San Diego in his own car but switched to a rental once he arrived, for reasons unclear. Investigators would later speculate that he left his own car with a friend in town to avoid damage to the tires on rough terrain. He didn't tell anyone which trail he planned to hike. That detail still bothers Leah. I asked him before he left, "Please drop a pin or something." He said he would. But he never did. The last confirmed sighting was the gas station footage, timestamped 6:47 a.m. on Thursday morning, April 15th. Owen had on hiking boots, a long-sleeved shirt, a beige sun hat, and his canvas backpack. He looked ready, calm, focused. What happened next would become a 13-month mystery, one built not just on what was found, but on what was missing. The rental car was discovered by a park ranger on April 20th. Parked legally, no signs of forced entry. The keys were inside, tucked beneath the seat. His phone was there too, battery dead, untouched since the afternoon of the 15th. On the dashboard sat an open trail map of the Eastern Wilderness Zone, an area known for its steep washes and minimal signage. Temperatures had spiked to 94 degrees Fahrenheit that weekend. The heat alone could cripple even seasoned hikers. Rangers launched a limited search that same day, gradually expanding it as Owen was officially reported missing by his sister and employer. But the terrain was unforgiving. No cell towers, no drones could penetrate the deeper valleys, and the creosote-dotted land seemed to erase all footprints. By the end of the month, the official search ended with no clues. Not a sock, not a footprint, not a wrapper. It was as if Owen Marshall had stepped into the desert and dissolved. The first official search began modestly. A ranger named Carla Mendez filed the initial missing hiker report after noticing that the rental car hadn't moved for several days. She said she had a weird feeling about it, and that feeling triggered what became a multi-agency operation. Owen's name entered the Interagency Missing Persons database within 48 hours, but by then, critical time had passed. The Mojave doesn't wait. By the time search crews were on the ground, they were already working against sun, wind, and terrain that rewrote its own trail markers with every gust. The eastern region of Joshua Tree, where Owen had likely ventured, is infamously difficult to search. Twisting canyons, sudden drops, and boulder fields that can obscure a person just a few feet away. The area he may have entered includes parts of Pinto Basin and the rugged washes off the Old Dale Mining Road. Land unforgiving to even experienced hikers. Searchers started with the obvious: nearby trails, popular photo spots, primitive campgrounds. Then they widened the perimeter. Over the course of 8 days, the operation grew to include aerial drone sweeps, scent dogs, mounted teams, and even infrared thermal imaging flights. But nothing. No heat signature. No campsite. No debris. Volunteers combed the ground on foot, sometimes in 100-degree heat, with rattlesnakes and uneven terrain making every step dangerous. At one point, a tattered white shirt was found caught on a Joshua Tree branch. Hope surged, but it turned out to belong to a local camper who'd lost it weeks before. A water bottle with a faded label was discovered in a wash and tested for DNA. Negative. It was like chasing a ghost across a landscape made of silence. Even satellite footage taken the day Owen disappeared was examined. No trace of human movement could be identified in the scrub. Leah arrived on the 3rd day of the search. The rangers walked her through what little they had. She broke down in the visitor center parking lot and stayed in a motel off Route 62, joining the volunteers every day with growing dread. "He's too smart to get lost," she told a local news reporter. "He plans things. He knows how to hike." But even the best plans can be humbled by terrain like Joshua Tree. One wrong turn in a canyon wash can leave you heading deeper into heat, further from shade, with no point of reference. Some wondered if Owen had intended to disappear, that maybe this was an act of willful retreat. But the people who knew him dismissed the theory. He had groceries in his Airbnb fridge, scheduled bills set up, and an open job contract waiting for him back home. He wasn't running away, Leah said. He was trying to find something. That's not the same. After 12 days of exhaustive searching, the official operation was scaled back. Volunteers kept looking on weekends for another month, led by hiking forums and GPS groups who had followed other high-profile desert disappearances. There were a few theories floating online. One suggested he'd fallen into an abandoned mine shaft. Hundreds dot the area, many unmarked. Another theorized a wildlife attack, though no remains or blood had been found. A more fringe explanation came from a Reddit post. He found something spiritual, and he stayed. The idea of Joshua Tree pulling people in isn't new. Locals talk of strange disappearances, inexplicable echoes, sudden shifts in light. Theories range from heatstroke-induced confusion to magnetic interference from underground minerals. None of them explained where Owen had gone. None of them brought closure. And by the end of June, even the desert had gone quiet again. 13 months after Owen Marshall vanished, a blistering heat wave swept through Southern California. Rangers were doing a standard post-fire season inspection, checking for erosion, washouts, and debris along backcountry access roads, when one ranger on foot noticed something unusual. A thin, chalk-white curve protruding just inches from the sand, tucked beneath a creosote bush that had survived the worst of the drought. At first, he assumed it was a bleached tree root or animal bone. But the second glance changed everything. It was a femur, human, sun-bleached, weathered, and partially buried in loose desert soil. He marked the GPS coordinates, flagged the location, and called in park authorities. The area was so remote that the recovery team had to hike in 6 miles with stretchers, water, and sunshade gear. By the end of the day, they had uncovered more than just a single bone. Scattered across a 30-foot radius, shielded by boulders and scrub, were the fragmented remains of a man. Alongside the skeletal remains was a deteriorated hiking backpack, one strap frayed, the fabric stiff and discolored by time. Inside was a battered water bottle, empty, a compact first aid kit, an analog compass, and near the bottom, wrapped in a Ziploc bag that had somehow survived the elements, was a small, leather-bound field journal. Forensic teams were dispatched. DNA samples were collected. Dental records were cross-referenced. Within 72 hours, the identity was confirmed. Owen Marshall had been found. Or at least, what was left of him. The family was notified in person. Leah later said that when she opened the door and saw the ranger's uniform, she didn't cry. "I didn't even speak," she said. "I just sat down. I already knew." For over a year, she had lived in limbo. Not hope, not grief, just an awful, suspended waiting. That wait was now over. But the answers? They were just beginning. The condition of the remains suggested exposure, not violence. There were no fractures, no indications of trauma, no evidence of animal predation beyond minor weathering. No clothes were found except a torn shirt sleeve, fused into the creosote roots, likely snagged as Owen collapsed. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as probable dehydration and heat exposure. A tragically common fate in the Mojave. But not everyone bought that. Not when they read the journal. Of the 48 pages inside, many were blurred or warped by time, but others were chillingly legible. And it wasn't what he wrote about nature or exhaustion that disturbed Leah. It was what he described in the final entries. He wrote about shadows in the stone, about sounds I can't trace, and about a strange feeling of being followed but never seen. The final entry was dated April 16th, just one day after his hike began. It read simply, "Still no way back. Something's watching." The journal would later be dismissed by authorities as the writings of a dehydrated, delusional mind. A common phenomenon in desert psychology, heat exhaustion mixed with sleep deprivation can cause hallucinations, confusion, and paranoia. But Leah wasn't so sure. She knew her brother's handwriting, his habits. She could tell when something was off. She believed he'd gotten lost. Yes, but something else had happened out there too. Something he couldn't name. The area where his body was found was over 12 miles off the nearest maintained trail. The route included 2 washed-out canyons, an incline that would be nearly impossible in full sun, and 0 natural water sources. Even experienced rangers were stunned. "I wouldn't hike that solo," one admitted. Not without GPS, satellite phone, and a lot of water. So how did Owen, careful, cautious Owen, end up there? Why was he still walking that deep into nowhere, hours after he should have turned back? In the weeks following the discovery of Owen's remains, his story became a footnote in local news. Hiker found dead in Joshua Tree after 13 months missing. A few regional outlets ran short segments on the recovery effort. A couple of hiking safety blogs referenced it when discussing solo travel risks. But beyond the press releases and the brief flurry of interest, Owen's case faded from headlines. That silence infuriated Leah. People don't just vanish into sand, she told a podcast that picked up the story months later. And when they do, someone should care about why. She wasn't angry at the park rangers, she praised their efforts. She wasn't angry at Owen, she understood why he went. What haunted her was the sense that everything had happened in a vacuum. No clear reason. No final phone call. No goodbyes. Just a man walking into the desert and never walking out. The journal pages were scanned and returned to Leah, who has never released them publicly. She allowed investigators to quote brief excerpts, mostly for psychological evaluation and forensic timeline reconstruction. But there were pages, she said, that didn't make sense in a normal way. She described one passage where Owen seemed to be writing to someone, not to himself, not to her, but to whatever was out there. In it, he wrote about how the silence began to feel alive, how the sun stopped moving the way it should, and how familiar rock formations seemed to shift position overnight. I think I looped back, but the landmarks are wrong, he wrote. They weren't like this before. Or maybe I wasn't like this before. These notes were dismissed as heatstroke-induced confusion by experts. But Leah kept returning to one line scribbled in the margin of an otherwise normal entry. If I don't come back, it's because I found something I wasn't meant to see. The investigation closed quietly in November. The official ruling, accidental death due to dehydration and prolonged exposure. Case closed. But to those who followed the story, the questions only multiplied. Hikers and amateur sleuths revisited Owen's route, retracing steps via GPS simulation tools. A few claimed that a series of ancient petroglyphs near the area he was found had previously gone unrecorded, symbols that looked eerily similar to the ones Owen had drawn in his journal margins. Others speculated about disorientation caused by magnetic anomalies, underground mining interference, or even unmarked sinkholes. The more fringe theories veered into the surreal, that Owen had slipped through some kind of liminal space, a glitch in the desert's topology. Of course, there was no scientific evidence for any of that. But in the absence of facts, mystery has a way of filling the silence. Leah received Owen's ashes in a small wooden box and held a memorial service by the ocean. It was quiet. Just a few friends, old photos, his favorite Nick Drake song playing over a Bluetooth speaker. She didn't want speeches. She didn't want comfort. She just wanted him to be remembered for more than how he died. But even then, she couldn't shake what he'd written. That strange final entry that wasn't about dying at all. It was about being watched. The words looped in her mind at night, echoing like footsteps behind her. Still no way back. Something's watching. She wondered if it was real, or if those were the words of a man on the edge, drained, disoriented, and dying. But deep down, she believed her brother hadn't lost his mind. He had been lost to something. Whether it was the vastness of the desert, or something stranger, she'd never know. What she did know was this. Owen went searching for quiet. What he found out there might have been something else entirely. Owen Marshall wasn't the first person to vanish in Joshua Tree National Park, and he likely won't be the last. While the National Park Service keeps official records of deaths and disappearances, many go underreported, especially in remote areas where foul play is unlikely and nature is the presumed culprit. Over the past 2 decades, more than 24 people have either gone missing or died within the park's 1,200 square miles. Most were found eventually, victims of falls, heatstroke, or poor preparation. But a few, like Owen, walked in with experience and provisions, and were never seen alive again. In 2014, a Canadian man named Paul Miller vanished during a short solo hike. His body wasn't found until 5 years later, just 500 yards from a trail. In 2010, the remains of hiker Edward Nieves were found by a dog walker, over a year after he'd disappeared, his bones scattered in a remote wash. The common thread? Isolation, extreme heat, and no clear explanation as to how they ended up so far off trail. Locals have theories. Some speak of old mines, dozens, maybe hundreds, collapsed and buried across the landscape, waiting for a wrong step. Others talk of the hum, a barely perceptible frequency some say causes disorientation. The rational explanations make sense: poor signage, lack of water, sudden weather shifts, and exhaustion-induced confusion. But once you dig deeper, it becomes harder to ignore how eerily similar some of these disappearances are. In many cases, experienced hikers made simple errors, heading into daylight with not enough water or underestimating distance. But others, like Owen, had maps, gear, first aid kits, and journals that raised more questions than they answered. Leah read about a woman in 2012 who vanished after texting her sister a single sentence, "I'm not alone out here," before her phone died. Her body was never found. Stories like that made Leah question whether something was truly random about what had happened to her brother. Beyond the documented cases, there's the folklore. Joshua Tree is steeped in myths that stretch back to Native American oral traditions, minor superstitions, and New Age beliefs. Some call it a thin place, a landscape where the boundary between reality and the unknown is blurred. Others believe it's haunted, not by ghosts, but by the land itself, a kind of memory stored in rock and silence. In 2017, a pair of amateur paranormal investigators reported strange EMF spikes near Ryan Mountain, close to where Owen was eventually found. While most dismissed them as interference from nearby radio towers, others weren't so sure. Stories of hikers seeing figures in the fog or hearing footsteps that don't match their own have circulated for years. Rangers, of course, deny any supernatural elements. But some, off the record, admit they've felt watched in parts of the park that GPS can't map properly. "It's the silence," one said. "It plays tricks. Or maybe it reveals things." What unsettled Leah most wasn't just that Owen had joined a growing list of names tied to the park's dark undercurrent. It was that his story sounded familiar. In a forum for family members of missing hikers, she found entries describing dreams, vivid and recurring, of loved ones calling from far-off canyons, their voices distorted, pleading. One woman whose brother had vanished 10 years prior wrote, "Sometimes I feel like the desert didn't kill him. It kept him." That line stayed with Leah, because no matter how many times she went over the case, how he walked in, how far he traveled, how impossible it seemed, she kept coming back to one unshakable feeling, that Owen hadn't just gotten lost. He had gone somewhere deeper. Somewhere the maps don't show. Even after the official reports were filed, even after the park rangers packed up their maps and drones, Owen Marshall's story refused to die. Leah couldn't stop reading the journal. She told herself she was trying to make sense of it, to process, to grieve, but the truth was she wasn't ready to let it go. The journal felt like the last conversation she'd ever have with her brother, and it didn't sound like the Owen she knew. The entries started clear and focused, filled with basic observations about terrain, temperatures, animal tracks. But as the pages went on, the tone shifted. The sentences became fragmented, repetitive, then strange. He wrote about a stone ring he found off-trail, about something he could hear at night, breathing, about a light that moved the wrong way. In one passage, he described a dream, or what he called a waking image, of Leah standing at the foot of his sleeping bag, saying his name, and then vanishing into smoke. He ended that entry with a sentence that haunted her. "If you're reading this, I hope you never come looking." Leah did something she wasn't sure she should. She scanned select pages from the journal, ones she thought wouldn't violate Owen's privacy, and uploaded them anonymously to a survivalist forum under the username DesertEcho21. She simply asked, "Does this sound like heat stroke? Or something else?" The thread exploded. Hikers, psychologists, park volunteers, even amateur cryptographers weighed in. Some dissected his sentence structure, claiming early signs of confusion from dehydration. Others focused on the descriptions, especially the part about the ring. Several users said they'd seen similar structures made from boulders in remote parts of Joshua Tree, too symmetrical to be random, too old to be recent. One geologist claimed the formations aligned with magnetic anomalies in the Mojave's tectonic plate map. Another pointed out that similar rock circles appear in other desert mystery cases, including the unsolved disappearance of Kenny Veach in Nevada. It's always the same story, someone wrote. They find something. Then they go missing. What startled Leah was how many strangers believed her brother had encountered something abnormal. Not aliens, not ghosts, but something undefined. A presence. A pattern. There's a design in these vanishings, one post claimed. The problem is, no one survived long enough to map it. Leah dismissed the more sensational replies, but she couldn't ignore the correlations that kept appearing. GPS coordinates that lined up eerily close to Owen's last location. Other hikers' journals describing similar watching feelings in the same sector. One man even posted drone footage of the area taken months before Owen disappeared, and in the video, there was a dark shape in the ravine that no one could identify. It wasn't clear. It wasn't proof. But it gave Leah something she hadn't had in a year: momentum. She started compiling these stories. Comparing timestamps. Plotting locations. Somewhere in the intersection of her brother's journal and the desert's secrets, she believed there was a pattern. Maybe even an answer. And then something else happened. Quietly, but unmistakably. Her inbox started filling with emails. Strangers. Other siblings. Other families. My cousin disappeared in the same zone in 2006. My dad vanished off trail near Mastodon Peak. Same month, different year. I don't know what's out there, but it took my brother too. Each story was slightly different. Different trails, different years, different search outcomes. But the underlying emotion was the same. A kind of unfinished grief. The kind that doesn't get a funeral. It gets a question mark. A missing person report with no closure. That's when Leah realized Owen's story wasn't isolated. It was part of something larger. Something silent. Something hidden beneath sand, stone, and time. And now, she wasn't just grieving her brother. She was chasing something else entirely. The truth. It took Leah Marshall 14 months to work up the courage to return to the place her brother died. She didn't go with news crews, or search parties, or a documentary team. She went alone. Quietly. It was late October. Temperatures were dropping, and the tourist crowds had thinned. The desert was quieter then, emptier. More honest. She stayed in the same Airbnb Owen had booked. Still listed, still sparsely furnished. Still with the old trail map folded on the coffee table. The owners had offered to remove it when they realized who she was, but she declined. She wanted to see everything he saw. Touch everything he touched. She walked the path he likely walked that morning, the Black Eagle Mine trailhead, where his rental car was found, still sees hikers most weekends. But Leah didn't stay on the trail. Guided by the GPS coordinates from the recovery report, she cut east, into the dry canyons and scattered creosote of the backcountry. She was careful. More careful than her brother had been, even. But she wasn't there to hike. She was there to stand where he fell. The terrain was harder than she expected. Loose gravel, steep climbs, sun exposure that made the hours feel longer than they were. It took her nearly 4 hours to reach the approximate area where Owen's remains had been discovered. There was no marker. No plaque. Just open land and wind and stone. She stood there, unsure what to feel. Not closure. Not peace. More like resonance. Like something had sunk into the ground, and she could still feel the echo. She opened Owen's journal and read from it aloud. One of the last entries. No sun today. I think it's behind the rocks. Or maybe they moved again. That sentence gave her chills the first time she read it. Now, standing where he may have written it, it made her stomach turn. She looked around. Everything was still. Except, it didn't feel still. She had that feeling people talk about in war zones and wild places, that thin-skinned awareness. Like being watched, even though there's no sound. No threat. Just presence. She found the creosote bush. Or at least she thought she did. The bush wasn't marked. But based on ranger notes, she was standing within a 10-yard radius of where the bone was found, pale and out of place. She knelt down and touched the dry earth. It was warm. Not just from the sun. From something deeper. She sat there for a long time, speaking softly. Not praying, exactly. Just remembering. Talking to Owen. Telling him what she'd found. What she hadn't. She told him about the emails, the theories, the strangers who believed. She didn't expect answers. She only wanted to be heard. And in that quiet, dry corner of a silent desert, she felt, just briefly, like she was. But as the sun dipped behind the mountains, she knew she had to leave. The desert doesn't welcome overnight guests in places like that. She turned to leave, but before she stepped away, something caught her eye, half buried beneath the soil near the bush. Not bone. Not metal. Just a small, worn scrap of paper. She picked it up. It was a torn corner of a topographic map, marked with faint graphite pencil. A circle around a dry wash, miles from even this remote point. Was it Owen's? Someone else's? There was no name, no context. But it reminded her of what one of the forum users had said. They always go deeper. The first sight is never the last. She folded it carefully and put it in her pack. Not as evidence. Not as proof. Just as a reminder. That even after returning from Joshua Tree, Leah wasn't the same, and she didn't expect to be. Something in the desert had settled inside her. Not just the grief. Not just the absence. It was something less definable. A pull. A weight. A responsibility. She stopped working full-time and shifted her life towards something else. Something she hadn't chosen but couldn't ignore. She began gathering stories of other desert vanishings, building a private archive with names, dates, GPS coordinates, and transcripts from loved ones. What started as a grieving sister's obsession slowly became something more like citizen investigation. People began reaching out not just to express condolences, but to ask questions, share details, compare notes. Some believed in patterns. Some didn't. But everyone agreed on one thing. Too many people had disappeared out there with too few answers. Leah called the project the map that doesn't exist. It wasn't public, at least not yet. But one day, she said, it might be. Meanwhile, Owen's story began to ripple out into places Leah hadn't expected. A popular podcast that covered unsolved wilderness disappearances featured his case in a special titled The Ring in the Rocks. The host read excerpts from Owen's journal, her voice echoing his final words. Reddit threads reignited with speculation. YouTube channels dissected his movements, analyzing satellite maps and trail reports, cross-referencing them with geomagnetic charts and native folklore. A short film student from CalArts created a silent desert reel inspired by his journal, pairing ambient desert noise with scratchy handwriting animations and strange, shifting topography. It won an award. Leah watched it alone and cried, not because it was sad, but because someone out there had seen what she saw. Owen's voice, his thoughts, had made it further than he ever had. He had become more than a cautionary tale. He had become a question, a presence, a reminder. She never turned him into a brand. There were no GoFundMe pages or books or hashtags. But Leah spoke, when asked. Quietly, carefully. She appeared on a wilderness safety panel. She wrote a guest essay for a digital grief magazine. In it, she said something that resonated with thousands of readers. Closure is a myth. You don't move on from loss. You learn how to walk with the absence. And that's what she did. She learned how to carry the questions instead of waiting for answers. She learned how to exist in a world where the last words from her brother were both terrifying and beautiful. She stopped needing the desert to explain itself. She accepted that it wouldn't. But that didn't mean the story had to end. In fact, it was still unfolding, in podcasts, in notebooks, in strangers who still emailed her just to say, I know that silence. I've been there too. One of the last emails she received that year came from a park ranger, anonymously. No name, no return address. Just a few lines typed plainly in the message body. It read, We've seen that rock ring too, but it's not on any official maps. And it wasn't there in 2019. No one built it. At least, no one who admits to it. There was no follow-up, no contact, but it didn't scare her. It confirmed what she already suspected. that there were layers to that land, some ancient, some hidden, some perhaps not meant to be understood. She printed the email and pinned it above her desk next to Owen's photo. Every time she looked at it, she thought of that page in his journal, the one scrawled in jittery handwriting and tucked in the back. Still no way back. Maybe that was true. Or maybe it meant you don't go back, because you have to keep going forward. Now we bring the story full circle, with a final paragraph that reflects, lingers, and leaves the audience haunted by what remains unknown. There's a silence in the desert that isn't just about the absence of sound. It's a density, like the land is holding its breath. Owen Marshall disappeared into that silence. He entered it looking for clarity, for stillness, for some kind of internal reset. What he found remains a mystery. What we know is that he walked into Joshua Tree with a pack full of gear, a journal full of questions, and a mind clear enough to plan and prepare. What we don't know is what shifted in him, or around him, that led him to the edge of the known map. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe the heat. Maybe something stranger. But whatever it was, it took him beyond where people usually go. His bones, found beneath a weathered creosote bush, told one story. His journal told another. And the land, as always, refused to comment. Every year, more people go missing in remote wilderness zones. Most are found. Some never are. But the ones who vanish and leave no reason, no signs of struggle, no farewell notes, no wrong turns, those are the ones that linger. Owen's case is now closed on paper, but open in the minds of those who followed it. His name lives quietly in park records, tagged with a cause of death that reads like a shrug. But his story lives elsewhere. In Leah's files. In online forums. In quiet emails exchanged between strangers with shared grief. In the footfalls of hikers who now tread those trails with one eye on the horizon and one ear tuned to the wind, wondering what might be out there. Or under there. Or above. Leah returns to Joshua Tree once a year. She doesn't hike far anymore. She just sits. Sometimes at the visitor center. Sometimes at the trailhead. She carries her brother's last journal entry in her wallet, creased and faded, always with her. It's not a totem. It's a promise. A reminder that loss doesn't end with burial. That stories don't end with conclusions. Some keep moving, evolving, whispering. She knows she may never understand what happened out there. But she also knows that not all mysteries are meant to be solved. Some are meant to be witnessed. If you walk deep enough into the desert, past the trails, beyond the signs, through the heat and the stillness, you might come to a place where nothing feels quite real. Where rocks seem older than time. Where shadows don't fall the way they should. And if you do, maybe you'll remember Owen. Maybe you'll think of the man who vanished not just from GPS or from maps, but from the safe story of what a disappearance is supposed to look like. You'll remember the journal. The creosote. The sentence that still hasn't stopped echoing. Still no way back. Something's watching.